This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week's guest is Philip Oostenbrink, head gardener at Walmer Castle and Gardens, collections coordinator for Plant Heritage in Kent, plant trials committee member for the RHS, and self-confessed jungle plant nut. Philip has just published a new book titled The Jungle Garden, and in this interview, I talk to him about what a jungle garden is, whether they can work in shady and sunny aspects, easy jungle plants, rarer ones, plant hardiness, seasonal and winter interest, and where to get plants. I began by asking what sparked Philip's interest in jungle gardens.
I think it's because I saw several gardens which were beautiful, and the first one I saw was Trescott Abbey on the Isles of Scilly, and I went there in 1998, and I still lived in the Netherlands then, and there were just a lot of things there that were just completely exotic and tropical to me, and I'd never seen before. And I'm a bit of a plantaholic, so if anything's rare and unusual, I like it. But then I went to Will Giles's garden in Norwich, the exotic garden there, and I think that really sparked the interest, because that was such a beautiful jungle garden with little paths going through, and you sort of had to find your way through the undergrowth and go through. So that's also when I already lived in the UK, and then I started finding more of those plants myself and discovering what I could grow here myself as well. And I think that's sort of what it was. I was always interested in foliage anyway. Even when I was at horticultural college, I looked a lot at the foliage of plants when I designed a garden. But I think especially Will Giles's garden was probably one of those where I thought, yeah, I do want this, and I do really like this.
Yeah. So are you actually inspired by the jungle itself and how the plants adapt and how they grow together when you do design spaces?
Yes, I am, because like in a jungle, if I create a jungle garden, I look at like the upper canopy first. So what can I do as good visual plants that will also allow some undergrowth? And I think it is one big inspiration, because you have the upper canopy in a jungle, then you've got the slightly lower stuff in the middle, and loads of things on the floor where there's hardly any bare soil, and lots of plants creeping through there. So I think that is definitely an inspiration, that you try and get that same effect in a smaller space, or even like on a patio if you can.
Yeah, and I thought it was really interesting reading the book, because I think a lot of people might assume that a jungle garden is just green foliage, but you talk about the importance of seasonal changes. So how might you incorporate that into a jungle garden scheme?
Well, I think if you look at the garden, of course, you want something over winter. So you have a certain structure within your garden. So you could use something, for instance, like a Trachycarpus, so the hardy palm, which is evergreen. So you have that all year round. But other things, of course, come and go a bit. And I do think that's important, because you get that sort of that need to go through your garden, have a look in your garden and explore to see what's different, what's come up. What has maybe disappeared even, because some things might be summer dormant. So you can use that a lot. And I do find that very important, because if you have a garden that is just the same all the time, then after a while you've just seen it and you just think, well, I don't really have to explore, because I know exactly what's in there.
I think people might not realise as well, you mentioned that you can get colour changes on foliage, and I think people might not necessarily think that goes hand in hand with the jungle garden.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because jungle garden doesn't mean you just grow exotics, because I think that's sort of the difference between what a lot of people think of maybe as a tropical garden and the jungle garden. I think with the jungle garden, you can use a lot of even normal plants you can get in a garden centre. So, quite common plants, but it's that effect you want. So you want the lushness and the differences in foliage shapes and textures. And definitely. I've got an Aralia, for instance. The common name is Devil's Walking Stick, and it's got this beautiful large leaf, and in autumn that'll turn bright yellow and bright red, all kinds of colours before the leaves drop. So it gives more then. And then, of course, in spring you could grow things that are early spring flowering bulbs. Like I've got some really funky variegated Fritillaria imperialis, the imperial crowns, and they flower sort of from February onwards. And they're really good as well. So you can definitely work with the seasons, and you don't want to have the same stagnant garden all the time, but you just have some colour changes, even in spring, but definitely in autumn as well.
So you wouldn't be averse to mixing plants from, say, different continents or different ecoregions?
No, I wouldn't. A jungle garden, because it is so dense, you can almost create a little microclimate within your own garden. So what I've done in my garden, because it's southeast facing, so it gets a lot of sunshine in my back garden. In summer, when the sun is high up, it's almost all day I get sunshine, and it shines over the house even. When you start with that upper canopy, you can sort of create a bit of a microclimate underneath, so it holds moisture in a bit, but also it creates shade. So you can then use things from different areas, different regions altogether, and different altitudes even, to get really the impact of a jungle garden. So to get all the differences in leaf shapes and textures.
Yeah, so that's an important point as well. You could have a garden, because again, I think people think jungle garden, shady, slightly more humid maybe, but your garden sits in full sunshine. Do you then need to create that canopy, or is it possible to have the jungle garden with plants that do cope with full sunshine?
Oh, that's definitely possible, yes. I've got a Tetrapanax, which actually quite likes full sunshine as well. That's very tolerant. But the main one, I would say, to create a good leafy effect in the garden, which is in full sunshine, is different figs. I've got quite a few myself. So I've got the normal fig, Ficus carica, but then a cultivar called Ice Crystal, which has got this beautiful leaf, which is almost like a snowflake if you look at it. But others are, for instance, Ficus Johannes, which is smaller, and you can easily grow in a pot as well. But you still got all these different leaf shapes and different leaf textures, which you can just grow in sunshine. And there are loads of plants that you can grow in sunshine that still give you that lush effect. You could also work with succulents, for instance. So you could work with the hardy aloe, so Aloe Ampelos striatula, which can tolerate full sunshine and no water for months on end, really. So there's loads of plants you can grow in a sunny garden as well as a shady garden.
If I was thinking about winter interest, you mentioned the Trachycarpus, and before we started recording, I said about the Dixter exotic garden. And in the winter, you've got a few conifers in there, and you've got some maybe bananas that have been wrapped in various different contraptions to overwinter them. So that, for me, that garden kind of is fairly bare in the winter, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, I presume.
Oh no, it doesn't. No, you can have quite a few evergreens in there actually, and I've worked with ferns. Another plant I love, and I've got a national collection of, is Hakonocloa, which is the Japanese forest grass, which likes it quite shady. And although it grows brown in autumn, it sort of goes this beautiful, like a wheat color almost, and you can just leave that until say early March before you cut it back. So you still have that structure and that linear leaf within your garden then. And yes, I mentioned ferns, the hardstone fern, for instance, Asplenium scolopendrium. That's a really nice evergreen one, which starts coming up again in March. So you don't have to cut it back until then. So yeah, that's just a few examples, but there are definitely lots of things you can have. And it doesn't all have to be evergreen, of course, because then you still get that it is quite samey throughout the year. But I think if you start planting out, if you use a structure, maybe you could even start with the evergreens and plan those out. And then well, this is also going to look great in winter. I know there's still some interest in winter as well then.
And also thinking about the different types of plants that you use, and you said, you can kind of mix and match. Is there any place at all for more traditional cottage style plants?
Oh, definitely. Yes. I'm growing fuchsias as well, for instance. So you could do that. And other perennials as well. One of the ones that is used in cottage gardens as well is the hardy sunflower. And I've got Helianthus salicifolia, so that is the one with willow-leaved foliage, really long, thin leaves. and it's just about to flower, actually. It's a beautiful perennial that grows up to 2.5 meters at least every year. So that's one you could use. And the other thing I use a lot is dahlias. And personally, I feel with the jungle garden, I don't use very bright flowers because I think then you're going more towards the tropical exotic look. So for me, it is really about the foliage. But if I use flowers, then I will use something which is a bit more subdued, maybe, and which will still look beautiful when you look at it up close, but it doesn't jump out at you, so it doesn't take over. If you look in the garden, then the first thing you see is a massive pink flower. But one dahlia, for instance, which is definitely a cottage garden plant, is a Verone's obsidian, which is this wagon wheel, almost black dahlia, and that's just a beautiful thing with bright yellow center. And yeah, I just love that, and I will always have that in my jungle garden as well. So you can't really match, but it's mainly about the look of the plant. So if you look at something, oh look, is it lush? Is it maybe nice and green? Is it good, beautiful foliage? Then you could use almost anything to achieve that look.
Yeah, it sounds. I think it comes across that it could be quite a personal interpretation of the theme. And it was when I was reading the book, I did wonder. I thought, you have such a gift for putting plant shapes and textures and contrasting them with each other. So thinking more about the mechanics of writing the book, did you have to take what was maybe an instinctual visual art that you had personally that was almost innate for grouping plants? And did writing the book make you think about that process? And was it difficult to actually say, okay, this is what I do, and to define what was the jungle look?
Yeah, I think it was, because it was indeed one of those things where I just always sort of naturally just had that thing, I don't like that next to each other because the leaves are too similar, they're the same shape, and I want to break that up a bit. It's to sort of look at that, and it was also part of how I redid my own garden earlier this spring. So when you think about this jungle gardening, and I was starting to think about writing this book, I looked at my own garden and I thought, well, how have I done this and how have I combined things? And then sometimes you look at things when you plant them out in spring, and I'll move them 4 times, probably sometimes, some of them, because I just look at it and I think, no, it still does not look right. I need something to break that up. So it's something that I maybe subconsciously do, but sometimes I have to look at things and then later I think, no, it's not right. I do need to move that a bit. But the writing the book has really inspired me to look at my own garden again, and I've changed it quite a bit actually, and really focused on a lot of greens because I do like the lush greenness. But variegation is also one of my my loves. So trying to incorporate the two and trying to make the garden even more interesting and really almost work by the rules that I've written about.
Yeah, and another thing people might assume is that a lot of the plants that you use wouldn't necessarily be winter hardy. Would that be a fair assumption?
No, not really. No, I've got a lot of hardy plants in my garden. I think I've only got a small back garden myself, and it's probably about, the planted area is probably about 6 by 6 meters, I would say. And out of that, I would say at least 90% is hardy, and I would just leave outside. There are a few bits in there where I might think, oh, it's a really nice plant, I don't want to lose it, and some of them have got their first winter coming now. But I'll just take some cuttings of those just as a backup and leave them outside. I am in East Kent, so we don't go down low, so we probably go down to about -6 at most in a very cold winter here. But a lot of the plants that I've written about in the book are hardy to -15, -20, or even more than that. So because I really wanted it accessible, and I also understand that not everyone wants to dig up their entire garden and has got the space to overwinter everything. So I really wanted to look at that as well. So there are definitely options of things you could overwinter, especially in colder climates, but also lots and lots of plants that are very hardy. And I've got one that's hardy to -25 at least. So there's really something for everyone in there.
Yeah, and if somebody was thinking of dipping a toe in the water with the jungle look, are there any really easy starter plants that you could recommend?
There are quite a few. And If I look at, for instance, one really nice one, which I've got in my own garden, is Colocasia pink china. And colocasias generally aren't very hardy, but this pink china has proved to be very hardy. That went through the 2010 winter in a pot covered in snow, and it was still fine. I can't actually overwinter any of the others. I've tried, like Black Magic is another one, and they always rot for me even if I dig them up in winter. But that's a really nice one. If you're looking at, say, like a begonia, there's Begonia ciliata, which is almost like a big African violet. And that's really nice because so it's got the hairy leaves as well, so you've got a different texture. Also very hardy, big round leaves. Love that one. And I think if you can fit one plant into your garden to give a tropical look, it would always be the Tetrapanax rex. I would definitely recommend. It's got the big palmate leaves, and it can create the upper canopy a bit. So it is quite a dense canopy. So you will need shade-loving plants underneath. But it's just one, and even if you can grow it in a big pot, then I think that really adds to your jungle look.
Yeah, just thinking about it as you were speaking, how easy is it to source some of these plants? Are some of them quite rare?
Well, you can make it as easy as you like, really. So if you can still get that look by just going into some more specialist nurseries, and some garden centres as well sell quite a lot of nice stuff. But for me, I am a plant collector, so some of my plants, of course, are quite rare. But I think the jungle look is becoming more and more popular. So you can definitely get more and more plants all the time, which is quite good. But it doesn't mean that if you want to start a jungle garden that you have just very rare plants that you cannot get anywhere. And that, again, that's not really what I was aiming for at all with the book. I just wanted a mix of some things might be quite difficult to get or quite rare, but might be coming up a bit more, and other things you can just get from your local garden centre. So it's an entire mix of some things are a bit more difficult to get, and other things might be very easy to get.
Yeah, I, as you say, being a plant collector, I do think maybe the jungle plants I could probably, speaking personally, maybe become a little bit obsessed and seek out things that are rarer and rarer. Obviously, that we have a lot of gardeners listening to the podcast who are quite advanced. If you wanted to try and get hold of something that was really rare or really choice to wow your friends, what would you choose?
Oh gosh, there's so many things I could think of. I think at the moment, I've got a slight obsession with Bomeria, which is part of the nettle family. And you can get them, and they're a bit difficult to source at the moment. But if you look at the leaves of those, so it is a nettle, it doesn't sting or anything, but it is almost like a giant stingray, and you've got some really beautiful ones in there. And I think a lot of people will look at that and think, gosh, that is unusual. I've never seen something like that before. So I think that's probably one of the ones that at the moment I'm very interested in, but I'm sure if you ask me in a year's time, I'll go, oh no, you really need to get something else.
Yeah, I'm sure. So again, thinking about specific plants, if you had to choose maybe your quintessential jungle garden climber, what might you choose?
Jungle garden climber, I would go for a fig then. As I mentioned before, I think you've got such beautiful leaves on there. They're quite easy to grow, quite fast growing as well. So they would like a sunny side, so that would be one of them. I think I would go for that. And if you want something even faster growing, then there's some beautiful vines as well, of course, like grapevines. Phytus cognetiae, for instance, is a really good one, massive leaves. So that would be a good one as well. But I think my first choice of anything would be a fig.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Tetrapanax. A, can you grow that in a pot? And B, if you didn't have that choice, what might you choose as a kind of small tree for a smaller garden?
I think the other one, which sort of gives the same look, would be a Trachycarpus, so the palm tree. You've still got a big palmate leaf then. Probably slightly smaller, slower growing, but it still gives that effect. The crown is a bit more open, so you can grow a few more things underneath a Trachycarpus, I would say, than a Tetrapanax. So that is a very good alternative, and you can get them at different heights. So you can buy them as a tiny little shrub or sort of smaller size, or sometimes you can get them like 2 meters tall, for instance, as well. So you've got a bit of a quicker impact then. But yeah, I think that's a good alternative for the tetrapanics.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about the ground cover level, I guess it's a fine line between something that is an effective ground cover and something that becomes a bit out of hand. Is there a cover plant that is that holy grail of well behaved, but actually does its job really well as well?
Yeah, I've got a couple. One thing I've grown this year is hardy fuchsia procumbens, which is a really nice little creeping plant with tiny sort of blue and yellow flowers as well. That does quite well. That is relatively hardy. It'll probably die down during winter, but it should come back in spring again. But another one, if you're looking at more of a linear leaf, then Ophiopogon would be a really good one, because you want to sort of create that almost like the undergrowth, as you mentioned it as well, but you could create almost like a mossy layer as well in there. And the dwarfier Ophiopogon japonicus would be very good for that as well.
Interestingly, I'm interviewing an author called Simon Morley. He's written a book about roses, and he wasn't talking about the jungle garden movement. He was talking more about new perennial style gardening and the trend for wildlife gardening. But he seems to think that kind of modern gardeners are maybe turning their back on roses a bit. So I thought it might be good to just throw that one in. Is there a place for any roses in a jungle garden?
I would think so, yes. There are some beautiful roses around, actually, which could still give that effect. Because if you look at the rose leaf, that is quite different to, for instance, a heart-shaped leaf, so it would be a nice combination with that. But I've grown Rosa omeiensis pteracantha in the past. I think that's changed its name, but it's the one it's got these bright red thorns on the stems, and they are beautiful, especially if you've got the sun behind it. So that would be something that could fit in very well. And Rosa glauca, the bluish one, that's another one. The foliage has got this sort of glaucous, obviously, look to it, so slightly bluish grey. And he's also a very good one, which I think could easily fit in a jungle garden.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Will Giles's garden, which I believe isn't in existence in that form anymore.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, which is a massive shame. And also you mentioned Tresco. If people wanted to go and see really good examples of jungle gardens, obviously they can look in your book, but are there any that they can go and visit that are particularly good?
Yes, I would think so. There's, I think with that, especially if you want to relate it to your own garden, which might not be acres and acres big, then you could look at on the NGS website, so the National Garden Schemes. There's Mike Clifford's garden in Poole in Dorset, which is a beautiful one, and actually his garden is on the front cover of my book because it is so good. And there are quite a few of those around, but of course, Great Dixter with their garden, the jungle garden is very good as well. But I would personally just really look at NGS gardens. But the other one, if you are going to see my Clifford in Dorset, then of course Abbotsbury Subtropical is a very, very good garden as well, with beautiful jungle plants, and a very good one.
Mm-hmm. And if people were looking for nurseries that did specialise in the plants, in these type of plants, I'm thinking probably in the UK, although we do get listeners from around the world. Have you got any sort of gems that you could recommend?
Oh, yes. They're actually right at the back of my book is a list of nurseries I recommend. And I think the ones that I've used so much for jungle plants is Plant Base, which is in Lamberhurst in Kent, or on the East Sussex and Kent border. There's Pan Global is a very good one in Gloucestershire, and of course Creek Farm in North Wales. I think they are just amazing nurseries, and I think all three of them even sell online, so you could just go through their website and have a look. But I think out of those three, you should be able to find something very special and for a good price as well.
Thank you, Philip. I hope you've been inspired to try out some of the easier jungle plants and to slot them in amongst your existing schemes, as you really can find one to suit every situation. Thanks to you for listening, And thank you so much to those of you who've rated and reviewed the podcast recently after my constant requests. I can see a few of you have done so, and I'm really very grateful. If you could all do it, imagine how many thousands of ratings and reviews I'd have. So please take 2 minutes to do it. Thank you. Bug of the Week is up next, and Dr. Ian Bedford is talking about a bug that has very sticky feet. If you've ever had one in your jumper and tried to get it off, you'll know what I mean.
Usually during March, the RHS publishes a hit parade of garden nasties, which lists the top 10 plant pests from the previous year. And every year, without fail, there's one pest that's always on that list, and usually near the top. And that's the black vine weevil, Otyorhynchus sulcatus. For the lucky few who've not encountered vine weevils in their garden, they're black flightless beetles, just under 1 centimetre long, with patches of tiny dull yellow hairs on their backs. And they have distinctive long broad snouts, with small elbowed antennae attached. Active from June to October, the adult weevils spend the day hidden amongst garden debris, emerging at dusk to feed nocturnally on leaves, making notches all around the edges. Although unsightly, their feeding won't affect the plant's growth, but their leaf notching provides a useful indicator as to where their much more harmful larvae might be found. Their larvae are cream-white, C-shaped grubs that live their entire life underground, feeding on roots, bulbs, corms, and the basal stems of many different plants within borders, pots and containers throughout the British Isles. And the damage they cause will often result in stunting, wilting, and even death to many plants where infestations are high. So how can we deal with vine weevils? Well, eradicating an established infestation within an open garden is near on impossible, since the adults will be numerous and widespread, and each will be a parthenogenetic female that'll lay around 1,000 minute eggs into the soil throughout the summer months. And the grubs too will be abundant underground, often protected amongst the roots of broadleaf evergreen shrubs and conifers. However, it's certainly possible that vine weevil infestations within open gardens could be significantly reduced by their natural predators, which can be attracted in by providing a safe environment with sheltered habitats and by not using pesticides. From predatory soil mites and nematodes to ground beetles, centipedes, toads, and the insectivorous birds should soon take control. Eradicating vine weevils from pots, though, is a much easier task, and it's best done during early spring, whilst the almost mature grubs are still in winter dormancy. Simply empty the affected pots, dispose of the old compost, and then after checking for grubs amongst the roots, repot any plants into fresh compost. Failure to do this will allow the grubs to become active again, pupate, and emerge as egg-laying adults a few weeks later. Once repotted, a dry topping of grit or even crushed olive pomace could be layered on the surface to deter any future roving adult weevils from accessing the compost. Perhaps followed later by a prophylactic treatment of commercially available predatory nematodes that can be watered through the pot topping during the summer months.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.